I'll never forget the first time I entered Bloodborne's Cainhurst Castle. The sense of terror and mystery that I felt as I entered this room was powerful and immediate and utterly confusing. And as interesting as I soon discovered the story of Cainhurst was, I also discovered that how Cainhurst told its story was even more interesting. See, unlike most video games, Bloodborne doesn't rely on exposition or ham-handed cutscenes to present its narrative, but rather tells a story almost exclusively through its environments and its gameplay. And no area demonstrates that better than Cainhurst. So today on Critical Rants, we'll be exploring why, nearly 5 years after we first entered this strange place, we still remember the horrors of Cainhurst Castle. Before we delve deeper into the castle, though, we have to understand how we got there. Cainhurst is entirely optional to explore and requires the player to backtrack through the game's largest level, the sprawling and snake-infested Forbidden Woods. After wandering down an easy-to-miss path, traversing a lake of poison, and climbing a very tall ladder, you'll arrive at the starting area of the game, Yosefka's Clinic. In this clinic, through a back entrance along the roof and atop the exact sickbed where you began your journey in Bloodborne, is a letter called the Cainhurst Summons. Its item description reveals that this letter, rather bafflingly, is addressed to you. Despite this insidious detail, you follow the instructions of the letter to a road of sorts called Hemwick Crossing. Here, a cutscene plays and you are approached by a riderless horse-drawn carriage whose door swings open on its own. As you climb into the carriage and it departs, the camera switches to a first-person shot of someone or something watching you from the bushes. When you arrive at the castle, the horses are long dead and the road behind you is completely destroyed. Any sense of control that you, the player, had, any idea that you are the one making the choices in this game, has now been wrested away from you. You've been led to this mysterious, frozen place by forces beyond your conception, with the only clue to that motivation being a vague letter that was intended specifically for you to find. Even the main gate of the castle and the doors by which you enter the castle swing open by themselves, rather than the player interacting with them via a button prompt like most other doors in the game. That may seem insignificant, but it further reinforces the idea that you, the player, have significantly less agency in Cainhurst than you do compared to other areas in Bloodborne. You're no longer forging your own path through the ruined streets of Yharnam. You've been thrust into a cold, alien world whose rules you are entirely unfamiliar with, and the only certainty is that you cannot fully comprehend these rules. And it is this unknowable element that leads us to the first way that Cainhurst Castle tells its story so effectively. The source of the horror doesn't just come from the disturbing nature of the setting, but from how quickly and thoroughly any sense of power and knowledge is stripped away from the player. Sure, up to this point, Bloodborne has been utterly opaque and impossible to fully decipher, and in fact, it can be easily argued that for the entire duration of Bloodborne's narrative, the player character is merely a pawn in a game far beyond their own understanding, but that is made most clear to you in Cainhurst. Any notion that you have agency within this story is snuffed out before you even arrive, and the fact that you now know this makes you all the more aware of how much you don't know. That's only one aspect of the horror, though. To fully understand the horror of Cainhurst, let's examine what little exposition we do receive about the place.
Once, a scholar betrayed his fellows at Byrgenwerth and brought forbidden blood back with him to Cainhurst Castle. It was there that the first of the inhuman Vile Bloods was born. The Vile Bloods are fiendish creatures who threaten the purity of the Church's blood healing. In his time, Master Logarius led his executioners into Cainhurst Castle to cleanse it of the Vile Bloods.
The man speaking is Alfred, a member of a group called the Executioners. As their name implies, the Executioners were a group dedicated to wiping out who they dubbed as the Vile Bloods of Cainhurst Castle. And it seems that they were successful in this regard, that the Executioners managed to slaughter nearly every person in Cainhurst Castle without any real difficulty. And that brings us to Bloodborne, like its spiritual predecessor Dark Souls, is renowned for its difficulty. And yeah, Bloodborne is a pretty hard game. What's interesting about Cainhurst from a gameplay perspective, though, is that it's one of the easiest levels in Bloodborne. Most of the enemies pose very little threat to the player, creating an atmosphere that is more oppressive due to the horror of those enemies' situations, and not because those enemies are relentlessly attempting to disembowel you. So to truly discuss the difficulty or lack thereof in Cainhurst, we have to first talk about there are only 5 enemy types in all of Cainhurst Castle. When you first arrive on the castle grounds, you encounter the Bloodlickers, flea-like beasts who appear wherever large quantities of blood are spilled. And it seems that these Bloodlickers at Cainhurst, after lapping up all the blood from the Cainhurst massacre, are now starving because they've run out of blood to drink. There are also these worm things, which are the most annoying enemies in the game, but anyway, both the Bloodlickers and the worms are found at the start of the level, and found only outside of the castle, so they're not really relevant to the bulk of the area. Speaking of not really relevant, the gargoyles. The gargoyles do a great job of blending in with the castle's architecture and keeping the player on edge, but they don't have as much to do with telling Cainhurst's story as the following 2 enemies you encounter, which are by far the most numerous. When we first entered the castle proper at the start of this video, we saw a Cainhurst servant, a cloaked, hunched figure furiously scrubbing at the floor as if their masters were still present. And as we soon find out, they are. This striking image is accompanied by ragged sobbing, and this sobbing permeates every room in the castle. The Silver Ladies, or Bound Widows as they're called, seeming ghosts of the noblewomen that were slaughtered here, are the source of these sobs, and they populate the castle in droves. What I want to highlight here is the visual design of these characters, and how much information we are provided through this design alone. There are 3 main details to note here, besides the obvious aspect of them being ghosts. The Silver Ladies' hands have been bound, their eyes have been covered by blindfolds, and their throats have all been cut. By merely examining the visual design of these characters, it swiftly becomes clear what happened to them. They weren't just killed in battle, they were taken prisoner and then systematically executed. With that in mind, it starts to make sense why these people, or what remains of them, would fill their home with perpetual cries of anguish. What about the Cainhurst servants who we saw when we first entered the castle? Interestingly, these people who made up the bottom of Cainhurst's social pyramid weren't just laborers, they were knights. The item description of the knight's garb reads, "A regal piece graced by intricate goldwork." The Cainhurst way is a mix of nostalgia and bombast. They take great pride even in the blood-stained corpses of beasts that they leave behind, confident that they will stand as examples of decadent art. Despite the fact that the knights were expected to maintain the castle and dispose of beasts, both seemingly lowly tasks, these knights were wrapped in decadence. In that sense, there was a backward sort of honor awarded to these servant knights. The few servants we meet in-game, however, are not celebrated. Their clothes are worn and ragged, their backs are bent from a lifetime of servitude, and they have grown immeasurably old. If these people were once great knights, they are but a flickering shadow of that now. While they are more aggressive and dangerous than the Silver Ladies are, they still pose very little threat to the player due to their small reach with their weapons and their low health pool. And this is where we return to the Silver Ladies, Cainhurst's most abundant enemy type by far, move and attack so slowly that you can literally walk away from them without putting yourself in any serious danger. What's interesting to consider is that we actually meet and battle against some of the executioners in-game. They're these hulking brutes wielding weapons as long as a man's body with the strength and vitality to back that up. What chance would these untrained nobles and a group of hunchback servants have stood against the executioners? The answer is clear in what remains of the castle. It was as I was recording footage for this video, as I closely examined the haunted rooms and corridors of Cainhurst, that I pondered a disturbing question. Where is all the blood? There's no getting around the fact that a massacre happened here and that an entire civilization was brought to ruin. In the library, we see books strewn around haphazardly. In the dining room, we see tables pushed aside and chairs turned over, all clear signs of a struggle, even if a feeble one. But why isn't there any blood on the ground or on the walls? My first thought was that the bloodlickers drank it up, but they're never seen inside the castle itself. It was only after I revisited the footage of this area that I realized the answer to this question had been right in front of me the entire time. Think back to what we witnessed at the start of the video, a servant scrubbing the floor to the point that it shone. And that's why I believe there isn't any blood in Cainhurst Castle, because the servants have scrubbed any and every trace of it away. Imagine being one of these servants, surviving the genocide of your people and spending years attempting to restore the castle, your home, to its former glory. All that time cleaning and scrubbing and trying to return things to the way they were, despite the fact that you will never achieve that. But what else would there have been to do? With that in mind, let's now return to when we first entered Cainhurst Castle, as I think we're finally capable of understanding what makes this encounter so gripping and powerful. The first thing the player will notice upon stepping into the entrance hall are these statues, which are presumably made to honor the nobles of this society. The statues are framed in the center of the room, and the lighting instantly draws the player's eyes to them. They're the brightest objects within the player's field of view and are thereby impossible to miss. There's a clear contrast between these statues, these glistening golden figures, and the rest of the dimly lit hall. They're also contrasted against the hunched figure feverishly scrubbing at the floor, and that contrast tells a story. The statues tower over this servant, and we as the player infer that this visual relationship was the literal relationship between these servants and these nobles. The way this room is lit, even the way this room is visually framed to the player as they walk into the hall, subtly communicates information about this place and its inhabitants. All of this is established without a single line of dialogue or exposition, and that's only a fraction of this encounter, which is only a fraction of the story of Cainhurst itself. If there's one aspect of this story that affects me the most, it's this. When the player character arrives at Cainhurst Castle, the massacre has already happened. There's no people to save, no bad guy to stop, no real objective. All we can do is bear witness to the tortured souls who remain here, to the noblewomen who cry endlessly over their lost home and lost lives, to the servants who work tirelessly to restore a castle to its former glory, despite the fact that they will never see Cainhurst rise again. And that, to me, is the ultimate tragedy of Cainhurst Castle. It isn't that this area is frightening or challenging or horrifying like many other areas in Bloodborne. It's that it's sad. What makes Cainhurst stand out amongst an ocean of video game levels and set pieces is that message, those powerful feelings of deep unease and melancholy that the player feels while traveling through Cainhurst Castle, is communicated almost entirely through gameplay. By the very nature of walking through Cainhurst, we understand its story, even if we can't initially process it. Simply by looking at the tired creatures that inhabit this place, we are forced to confront its story. That is the definition of excellent environmental storytelling, and that is amazing. Like most areas in Bloodborne, the sense that something is deeply, fundamentally wrong is present in Cainhurst, but it's turned up to 11. And I have no doubt that as the years go by, we'll remember Cainhurst Castle as one of the greatest video game levels of all time. There's so much more that I could mention here, and so much more that deserves to be discussed, but I'll restrain myself to just 2 quick details that I haven't yet covered. The first is the sound design. It sort of speaks for itself, but the sound design is highlighted by the complete lack of music in the area. As with nearly every level in Bloodborne, all the player hears are their own actions and the noises which occur in the environments. The ceaseless cries of the bound widows, the player's footsteps echoing in the empty halls, even the howling of the wind across the rooftops, all of those are brought to the forefront of each encounter in Cainhurst. This creates a soundscape that is just as unnerving as the physical landscape that the player character traverses, even if it isn't as obvious as its visual counterpart. Interestingly, we only have access to a small portion of Cainhurst in-game, as most of the castle is in ruins, likely as a result of the executioner's assault. This may actually explain why there are so many noblewomen and so comparatively few servants, as the areas we have access to within the castle were used mostly by the nobles. After all, we navigate through sections like the library and the dining room, where portraits of Cainhurst's most significant residents are hung on the walls. There wouldn't be such displays of wealth and decadence if we were exploring the servants' quarters, would there? Cainhurst was clearly a culture that valued appearance above all else, and that is certainly communicated through the visual designs of each room in the castle. I haven't even talked about Cainhurst's boss fight yet, and what lies beyond it, but I think I'll end the video here. I could ramble on about Bloodborne lore for hours, but if you're interested in diving further into the mind-boggling story of Bloodborne, I've linked several amazing videos and channels in the description. And of course, the best way to experience the story of Bloodborne is simply to play the game. That's going to wrap it up for this video, but if you enjoyed watching it, consider dropping a like and a comment, subscribing to my channel, and following me on Twitter, @critical_rants. Given that Bloodborne might be my favorite game of all time, this won't be my last video on the topic. I have so many more video essays about this game planned, but there's other topics I'll be discussing on the channel first. In fact, next time on Critical Rants, we'll be discussing something even more terrifying than Cainhurst Castle. Actually, that's going to be a lot, so I'm going to talk about something I love first. I'll see you guys then.
I tell you, I will not forget our adage. Fear the old blood.
75 years later.